Okay, this is the third and final part of the Tagore and Kipling lecture, which I've split into podcast length uh, 15-minute sections. So the first one was on the general history of British India and Victorian India in particular. Second one looked at biographies of Kipling and Tagore himself. And then we're going to pass over finally to the stories. I want to start from the quotations I introduced at the end of the last section. You can obviously go back to those if you want, but just as a quick reminder here, particularly if you're listening to the lecture in three parts, the letter that Kipling sent described India as heterogeneous, as a diverse, often contradictory, often violent historical life, which encompassed that variety, that diversity of cultural, linguistic, religious groups contending against each other in Kipling's view at least. And the interesting thing was that they were barely contained by the imperial structures that colonial Britain had placed over that seething Indianness. Now, as we discussed back then, that's a relatively kind of racist set of tropes, and I think when we actually read that quotation into the stories, you'll begin to see some of the resonances of Kipling's very problematic racial attitudes towards India. Tagore, a not entirely dissimilar quotation, one from an interview given in English in the 1930s, thinking back to his earliest stories in Bengal, where he claimed that they had the freshness of youth, they were filled with tender feeling, they were drawn from his own experience as a landlord visiting family estates, particularly among the rivers of Bengal, and how he was touched by the simplicity of the modes of life of, of village Bengal, and the lives of the villagers. So that's the quotation I wish to read into some of the Tagore stories. Let's start with Kipling and In the House of Sadhu, because it's instantly a space which has quite a lot of diversity. It's quite a chaotic space. And we have, for example, a Kashmiri prostitute. The narrator's ethnicity or identity is rather unclear. In fact, the narrator is very standoffish about putting themselves forward. They just describe themselves as me with a capital M and describe themselves as a chorus on the action. The story itself is set in Lahore, in the Punjab, but of course, the real gaze of the story is drawn towards the mysterious seal cutter who carries out this kind of magic ritual, and it's in that kind of gothicized, exoticized, quite terrifying magic that you see a really racialized, exoticized picture of India. In Kipling's quotation, he described the seething life of India, the heterogeneous life as India, as being as sort of wondrous as anything in the Arabian Nights. The Arabian Nights being a kind of immensely lengthy set of often supernatural stories associated with, well, what we now call the Middle East. So already an Orientalist trope, or a reference that goes into the European imagining of Asia, of the East. And so when Kipling positions this kind of dark magic in his story in the House of the Sadhu, in the House of Sadhu, he's very much sort of turning that space into, I suppose, the real India, what he claims to be doing, or the India that he perceives as real, peeling away those layers. And in that sense, some of the framing is quite interesting. The fact that the narrator, perhaps jokingly, has suggested that he might make lieutenant governor. So again, he might be white, he might be a member of the Indian elite. And one thing he does, which quite a lot of European short stories that feature supernatural elements in the 19th century do, is he uncovers that magic as false. In fact, the ritual magic of the seal cutter is a series of tricks. So he brings in a kind of skeptical modern gaze to uncover stuff that some of the credulous natives fall for. Another interesting bit of framing is section 420 of the Indian Penal Code. And I suppose this kind of crazy, slightly gothic, violent, dark, magical set of events, and then colliding with the references to section 420 of the Indian Penal Code. What Kipling's doing there is dramatising that tension that he talked about in the quotation. What he sees as a really long-standing and ineradicable native identity, Indian life, which runs on kind of undisturbed by all the elaborate bureaucratic apparatus of empire. So it's no accident that he chooses something to do with colonial law to dramatise those collisions of worlds effectively. But I wonder if the story is a little bit more complex than that. I don't think that lets Kipling off any kind of racist hook. But one of the interesting things is, of course, as I've already highlighted, the magic of the seal cutter is exposed as fake. And one of the things that is a trick is he manipulates imperial technology. He understands that he can get news from a certain destination through the telegraph, which seems to be faster than news would traditionally be carried. And so that enables him to manipulate people. But of course, he's doing that through modern colonial technology in order to then trick people through a superstitious magical ritual. On the other side of the equation, almost the same dynamic flipped over, is the narrator points out that the financial statement, that is the kind of economic and commercial government apparatus of empire, is itself a form of kind of dark magic, which is a sort of quite satirical way of looking at colonial bureaucracy and perhaps its irrationality. So there's a little bit of crisscrossing there. Another Kipling story that I think dramatises this collision of worlds, or the collision of worlds that Kipling's racialised view of British India presupposes between civilised white and this kind of undercurrent of heterogeneous, violent, magical, strange Indianness, is Beyond the Pale, which is very much about that. And it's announced in highly racialised ways right at the beginning. A man should, whatever happens, keep to his own race and breed, let the white go to the white, the black to the black. These very racialised attitudes. Then whatever trouble falls is in the ordinary course of things. It's not sudden, alien, or unexpected. But this is the story of a man who willfully stepped beyond the safe limits of decent everyday society and paid for it heavily. What happens is he becomes seduced by the native, in Kipling's view. He's lured into a space that he shouldn't be in. It seems exotic, it seems alluring. There's all those kind of Indian codes for amatory or seductive activities. But of course, when he finally peels away the last layer, he ends up being stabbed. And so what he really uncovers in the heart of India here, in Kipling's view, is violence, and a violence that comes back to wound and destroy the white colonial subject who ventures too far into that India, that space, who allows those colliding worlds to blur. It's a kind of historical irony that the title Beyond the Pale is historically the colonial boundary around Dublin in Ireland, which of course was at the time a British colony as well. Moving on to Tagore, like I said, what is quite interesting in Tagore's own account of his early short stories is he feels he's moving from his urbane world of Calcutta and going out into the Bengal countryside. And I think there's something there about, I suppose, both writers thinking about an India that is changing, an India that is being transformed. For Kipling, he feels it, in a sense, it can't be transformed. There is a historic Indian existence or an Indian identity over which the colonial modernity is only a thin veneer. Tagore obviously is going to have a slightly different opinion, but it's interesting. He goes out into the villages, he has tender, sympathetic reactions, but of course that rural life was being transformed by empire and by the changes implicit in empire, just as his own city, Calcutta, was being radically transformed. So there's a kind of nostalgic dynamic, and I suppose he's looking to the Indian countryside as a way of reflecting on, meditating on what's happening to India as a nation, or a proto nation, as a territory, at a moment of great historical flux, as we've explored throughout the lecture. Anyway, two examples of the tenderness. One, I think, is the dramatisation of himself as a modern narrator looking at other parts of a changing India, which represents something from a past that his modernity is leaving behind. It's probably easier to just read out the quotation. It might seem like poetry, a man and a woman mysteriously conversing on a rocky mountainside, hot from the pen of a poet. It would rouse in the reader's heart the sounds of streams gurgling in mountain caves, or wonderful music of Kalidasa's Meghaduta or Kumara Sambhava. Yet surely there must be few representatives of young Bengal who would not have felt ridiculous sitting in boots and mackintosh by the Calcutta road on a muddy rock with a ragged Hindustani lady. So young Bengal is a very progressive, middle class, modern, reformist movement. And he's positioning himself as that urbane, modern narrator. And it's weird, even though they are both, of course, ethnically Indian, the urbane Indian narrator is finding certain aspects of the Indian experience. For example, this Hindustani lady who he's met in a mist-wreathed path. It's like he's travelling back into his country's own past, or rather across perhaps from certain very modern parts of the British Indian experience, experienced on the behalf of natives, to other parts which are kind of just different, I suppose, not necessarily deeper, but represent a different set of values. And of course, one of the questions for Indian nationalist consciousness, which we explored in the previous segment of the lecture, is how does Indian modernity and the Indian future engage with its past, for example, some of the practices of Hinduism, e.g. And I think it's interesting that False Hope really dramatises that collision between a modern, urbane Indian narrator and other kind of more mystical elements, I suppose, or magical elements or imaginative elements of an Indian history, or other elements of indeed Indian geography. It's a very heavily sort of, dramatised moment. And then the mist clears and suddenly Bengalis and Englishmen appear. And that's like the intervention of modernity on what had been a very seductively imaginative scene. So in a weird way, not entirely separate kind of dynamic to some of the collisions that Kipling stages as well, but obviously in a much more sympathetic and less racially problematic way. Finally, one of my favourite stories, The Living and the Dead, as an example of Tagore's sympathy. Now, it's a story that at first appears to interlink, as I've said on the slide here, rural Indian life with a certain kind of superstition, with backwardness. It is normally a kind of gothic story, it's a ghost story, but there's no, one way of writing a story like that would have been to play up the credulity of the villagers, how stupid they are to believe in ghosts. And Kipling does something like that, not with villagers, but with natives in his story, with the seal cutter. But of course, that's not what Tagore does. He actually inhabits the perception of the ghost to some extent. He really has feeling and shares feeling, gives a lot of expression through the narration to what it feels for this widow who appears to be neither alive nor dead, a kind of ghostly existence. And he really makes the story about sentiment, about the power of affection, about the intensity of affection, and particularly the bond with this child, which structures the entire story. And it's kind of an interesting thing that Tagore does quite a lot in his short stories, is he always has sympathy with, or quite often has sympathy with, siding with the outcast, I suppose, and particularly wronged women. That's something he does a lot. Now, obviously, when I put Kipling and Tagore side by side there, and I say, well, Kipling is trotting out these racialized views of India. He thinks it's savage. He thinks it's this thing that even British law and civilization cannot ultimately affect or touch. Whereas Tagore has this sympathy, this generosity to understand as much as he can about the diversity of his country's experience, or what will become his country, I suppose, if we're talking about modern day nation states. Of course, it makes Tagore a much more appealing author, but to some extent, I guess, just to wrap up, I'm not too bothered about that, because of course Rudyard Kipling, although a very proficient short story writer, is also an intensely controversial figure. You may have seen quite recently there was a Kipling poem on the wall of a students' union which was scrubbed out because students say, well, he's a racist, he was an apologist for empire, and his work is racist. Now, I don't think that means we should stop reading it. I think it means we read it, we look at it in context, we are critical where we need to be critical. We certainly don't look at it in an unthinking or unreflexive way. And also, it's really important, I think, or really useful, which is something we've tried to do on this course, is to bring Kipling together with Tagore, because obviously they're working in the same form. The short story here, and in fact their careers, as we explored in the second segment of the lecture, have quite a lot of affinities. In some ways their lives ran in parallel, although of course they couldn't run in parallel because one was Indian and one was white, and despite all the complexities, that racial binary is of course the one that structures the experience for nearly everyone in British India in the 19th century, and of course you can't get away with that. So I hope what we've done by setting Tagore and Kipling is to give a picture in the round, and there are lots of ongoing debates about decolonising the syllabus, and hopefully this week or at this segment of the course, that's precisely what we've enabled you to do, and to think about these issues with the best possible selection of texts. Thank you very much.